And so without any further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Philip Mansell, who will be talking about the French monarchy between coronations and revolutions from Louis XIV to Charles X. So, Dr. Mansell.
Thank you very much, Edward. Good evening. And I'm going to focus tonight on coronations, but always in the background in the French monarchy, as indeed many others, there was always the threat of violence. And I'm beginning with this wonderful picture by Baron Gérard, Premier Peintre du Roi, exhibited in 1817. It shows the entry of Henri IV into Paris in 1594 after years of civil and religious wars. Now, he'd already been crowned in Chartres because Reims, the coronation city of the kings of France, was under enemy control. He'd already won many victories and spent a lot of money buying his enemies of the Guise family and many others, buying their submission. But still, Paris had been resisting, and he had to enter through a breach in the walls, shown here. So the role of King of France was extremely difficult, and whether you were crowned or not was not the decisive factor. Henri IV would himself, the most popular and admired king of all kings of France, would be murdered in the streets of Paris in 1610. His predecessor, Henri III, had been murdered at Saint-Cloud in 1589. Both of them had been crowned, but it didn't stop people touching Loin du Seigneur, as the Lord's anointed is described in French. And this warning shot, despite all the splendor of coronations, and none was as splendid as the coronation of the King of France, is a reminder that in the end, as Lenin said, most regrettably, power comes from the barrel of a gun. And now here is the coronation of his grandson, Louis XIV. 1654, 7th of June, he's crowned in Reims. It's a magnificent ceremony. He performs the part perfectly. There are many cries of Vivat Rex in aeternum, Vive le Roi. He's given the orb, like all other coronations, the sword of justice, golden spurs. He receives the homage of the peers of France. In this picture, which actually rather amazingly is in Rokeby Castle in North Yorkshire, you see the ceremony again, the dominance of the bishops and archbishops on the right, the peers of France on the left. There's a box for his mother and aunt, the widowed Henrietta Maria, on the right. You can see they're leaning out of the box to see better. They're leaning over the edge of the box. But the coronation was a bit of it wasn't really as grand as it could have been, because there are many absentees, including his uncle, the Duc d'Orléans, his powerful cousin, the Prince de Condé, another cousin, the Prince de Conti, because they were all in rebellion against the king, or had been in rebellion against the king. And the king himself was a born soldier, and he would spend much more time fighting with his troops in the trenches that same year, 1654, than he had at his coronation festivities. But it's interesting in the account of the festivities that he is in fact compared directly to Jesus Christ, the king as a sacred figure. And I quote, Jésus et Louis couronnés, tous deux nous sont des dieux donnés. L'un est le fils aîné, l'autre l'époux de l'Église. Jesus and Louis crowned, both are given to us by God. One is the eldest son, that is the King of France. the other the husband of the church. He is King of France. Jesus is King of heaven. And to add a note of frivolity to this very august and sacred ceremony, despite its length taking up the whole day and Louis XIV's youth, he insists on giving a supper party for the ladies of the court that evening. He's already very keen on entertainments and female company. There is another print of his coronation. All these grandiose French coronations are commemorated by Livre du Sacre, much more elaborate than those for the kings of England. And the coronation remains a memory. Here he is the great portrait by Rigaud, Hyacinthe Rigaud, 1700, 46 years later, but he's presented in the coronation robes, which in fact he only wore on the day of coronation. But he's holding the scepter. The crown is beside him, and attached to him is the great sword of Charlemagne, a magnificent medieval sword made circa 1100, with which all kings of France were girded, and which you can see in the Louvre today. Even the French revolutionaries did not destroy it. It was recognized as a work of art. And please note that he's wearing red heels, the great sign of court nobility in Versailles, which later spread across Europe as a fashion. And I think red heels are still worn by the pages of the King or Queen of England today. And there is the sword as it's presented in the Louvre, or that was for an exhibition at Versailles. Much, of course, reworked since 1100. There is the feeling that the kings of France, the coronation has been going on at Reims since the 10th century. It's Reims because it was the center of the Franks, of the original Frankish kingdom, and it's performed by the Archbishop of Reims. And the King of France was also anointed with holy oil kept in the Sainte Ampoule, or holy flask or ampulla, at the Abbey of Saint-Rémy in Reims. And French royal myth has it that the holy oil was brought by a dove from heaven to Reims. And this is the hand of justice. The scepter crowned by a figure of Charlemagne, made in the 1370s and used coronations since 1380. Also, it can be seen in the Louvre. But Louis XIV, as I said, was in his heart a soldier. Here he is crowned by victory, with the laurels of victory outside Maastricht in 1673, represented as a Roman emperor. And he liked to see himself as a Roman emperor at least as much as a Christian king of France, descendant of St. Louis. And Versailles is really a creation to vie with ancient and modern Rome, to show he's the equal of the Roman emperors. And he believes not in divine right, not in divine authority. He had seen as a boy in the rebellions of the Fronde how frequently that could be flouted, even by his own close relations, like his uncle Orléans and his cousin Condé. He believes in the power of guns. And here is one of his guns in the courtyard of the Invalides, marked with one of his favorite mottos, Ultima ratio regum, the last argument of kings. And he ruled through his massive and very well-trained army of 200,000 to 400,000 men, which, despite many defeats, maintained his authority in France. Next coronation, 1722, Louis XIV has been succeeded by his great-grandson, Louis XV, Louis XV. He is very young. He becomes king at the age of 5 in 1715, and in 1722, when he's only 12, he is crowned king in Reims. And the ceremony goes very well. It had been delayed till October so that the champagne harvest, the grape harvest, could be come in. All the royal regalia come with the monks of Saint Denis. There are many cries from the crowd at here is the crown made specially for the king, which was then full of the best crown jewels, much better than the crown jewels of England, which often had to be hired. The King of France had their own, including the Sancy diamond and the many Mazarin diamonds and rubies, the Côte de Bretagne, and many others. And this crown can also be seen in the Louvre today. It has also survived the revolution. Here the king is leaving the great cathedral of Reims. I recommend to all of you a visit to Reims. It's an easy train journey from Paris. The cathedral is magnificent, and next to it there is the Palais du Tau, the former archiepiscopal palace, which is full of coronation regalia, plate offered to the archbishops of Reims, and so on. And you see how the square is packed with guards. The route is lined with Gobelins tapestries. You have to imagine the cheers of the crowd, many of whom were at least as impressed by the king's beauty as by his rank. There were many cries of, "Oh, il est beau comme l'amour." "Ah, he's as beautiful as love." And there were arches of triumph. Many foreigners came to see the coronation. Here is the coronation feast after the coronation in the cathedral, watched by ladies, and he's feasting with the Knights of the Holy Spirit. Because one feature of the French coronation was that although it was newer than the Order of the Garter, the Order of the Holy Spirit, founded by Henri III in 1576, I think, had a very prominent place in the coronation ritual. The king would ritually embrace every night after his coronation and then feast them in the archbishopric afterwards. And here you see Louis XV, 1730, also Barrigo, also with red heels, and you can see why people were so impressed by his looks. You see he has the hand of justice, the scepter, and the crown. And it was a huge success as a ceremony. At the beginning of his reign, Louis XV was extremely popular. And after the coronation, as Louis XIV did throughout his reign, he touches for the king's evil, for scrofula, because the King of France has magical powers and is considered to cure those afflicted with scrofula, and people would come even from Spain to try to be cured by the King of France. So Versailles was not only a huge political military hub and an entertainment center, and also like a center for social services, but also a health center in some people's opinion. And now 1775, Louis XV's grandson has acceded to the throne as Louis XVI. The coronation is held in June 1775. It's again, you see how special seating is installed in the cathedral for the ladies. For Marie Antoinette, who is a mere spectator, she wasn't crowned beside Louis XVI. People were already afraid of her influence. Many cheers for the king, young and popular at the start of his reign. He's given the scepter and the sword of Charlemagne, and he sticks to tradition. Turgot, his reforming minister, had wanted the coronation to take place in Paris, but he insists that it is in Reims, and he also touches for the king's evil afterwards. Here is another print showing the king bowing before the altar. Another print showing the anointing of the king. Again, he's bowing before the archbishops. And another scene from the coronation of Louis XVI, a reign which began very well indeed, and which was then crowned by victory, a French victory over Britain, helping to create the independent United States. But thereafter, the reign became less popular, scandals, and above all, financial deficit. The revolution, the king, despite his sanctity, despite his initial popularity, despite his huge army, allows himself to be dragged by force to Paris in October 1789. And I won't depress you with an account of the revolution, but it all ends. Here he is in his coronation robes, painted by Duplessis. And here is the terrible scene on the 21st of January, 1793. The king is guillotined in what is now the Place de la Concorde in Paris. And the silence of the people, as a great counter-revolutionary Rivarol wrote, would always be a humiliation for the French monarchy. However, old habits die hard, and within 12 years, the French monarchy had returned in the shape of Napoleon Bonaparte. And in a series of carefully planned steps, he he takes power by the coup of Brumaire, 1799. He creates his own privileged guard. He moves back into the royal palace of the Tuileries in 1800. He begins to hold court receptions and create elaborate costumes for his officials in 1801. In 1802, he is voted first consul for life. His government then seems a huge success, many reforms, and peace with Europe. And in 1804, he creates a hereditary empire in the person of himself and his brothers, Joseph and Louis and Jerome Bonaparte, and he is crowned in the Cathedral of Notre Dame by no less a person than the Pope himself. Here we see the Emperor and Empress in procession to Notre Dame. Please note the amount of troops on the street. It was above all a military monarchy defended by victory and force. And here we see the very famous picture by David of Napoleon crowning the Empress Josephine in Notre Dame, being watched by the Pope, Pius VII, who had come specially from Rome for the occasion. Please note all the costumes on the officials, paid for by government money, and on the right, in a red cloak, the figure of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, who was then Grand Chamberlain of the Emperor, as well as Vice Grand Elector of the Empire and Minister of Foreign Affairs, a key court and government figure who helped arrange the ceremony and the court of Napoleon. Here he is crowning the Empress. You see the Pope looks rather exasperated. The pictures by the genius David, an extreme revolutionary who had become a courtier of Napoleon. He is premier peintre de l'empereur and remains loyal to the dynasty even after Waterloo. Napoleon is wearing the crown of laurel leaves, which was later destroyed by Louis XVIII and the Bourbon Restoration. And here is another often forgotten aspect of the ceremony, where the emperor swears an oath to the constitutions of the empire. And that oath, by his despotism, he was considered to have broken. And he's deposed on April the 1st, 1814, by the Senate, which he had helped to create, on the grounds that he's broken his constitutional oath. Here he is painted by Isabey in what is called the petit costume de l'empereur. It doesn't look very small to me, and please note he's wearing more feathers in his hat than Marie Antoinette ever did. On the left is the hand of justice created for Napoleon's coronation. On the right, the special crown of Charlemagne, invented tradition, saying that he's a new Charlemagne, not a new King of France, a new Emperor of the West, filled with Roman cameos. That can also be seen in the Louvre. And here he is painted by Ingres, hand of justice and scepter and crown of laurel, a wreath of laurel leaves. An extraordinary image of imperial power, a sign that monarchy had been rebranded for the 19th century. The Bonapartes would last as a dynasty until 1870. And it was a dynasty. He appointed, on the left is his brother Jerome, King of Westphalia. On the right, Joseph, King of Spain. These are fantasy coronation portraits done by Baron Gérard. Again, hand of justice, scepter and crown. But it shows that these brothers, who had very ropey, shaky thrones, they bothered to have themselves painted wearing the coronation robes that never existed, and with the coronation insignia that never existed. And here is Talleyrand as Grand Chamberlain of the Emperor, painted by Prudhon, but he's already probably plotting the downfall of Napoleon, who had insulted him personally, frequently, and of whose conquests he had come to disapprove. And he also, in 1814, is the mastermind with the Senate in organizing the deposition of the emperor. 1814, Louis XVIII returns with the support of the great powers of Europe. Here he is in coronation robes with a rather strange crown. He is reviving the figure of La France éplorée, France in tears. He's bringing her back to life, with the Tsar of Russia, the King of Prussia, and the Emperor of Austria supporting him. In the background is the royal yacht which had taken him from Dover to Calais. And here he is painted by Baron Gérard. In fact, he's too old and ill and fat to ever be crowned, although he did plan a coronation in Reims in 1815 and in Sainte-Geneviève in Paris in 1819, but he never got round to it. But he did bother to have himself painted with coronation insignia, and he does, I mean, a whole other story is the fate of the French crown jewels, which had been particularly magnificent under Louis XVI. They are looted and dispersed during the Revolution, but gradually they are brought together or renewed by Napoleon with his sense of monarchy. So they're restored to their ancient splendor. And then Louis XVIII also buys jewels for his nieces. So in the 19th century, the French crown jewels are just as splendid as in the 18th. Here is Louis XVIII's of the robe made, I think, to decorate Louis XVIII's hearse when he dies in 1824. It can be seen at Saint-Denis, the funeral church of the kings of France, with a funeral crown. And 1825, Louis XVIII has died. He is succeeded by his younger brother, Charles X, the former Comte d'Artois, who is crowned with great magnificence in the Cathedral of Reims, like his predecessors. And the myth is that a drop of sacred oil from the holy ampulla had been preserved during the revolution, so it's revived. A new Sainte Ampoule is created for the ceremony. You note that there are now armed guards in the middle of the church. That is a sign of the 19th century. And he himself wears diamonds. He likes jewels. The French crown jewels are increasing in value. And here is a moment in the coronation drawn by Ingres. You see again, special seating is installed in the cathedral for ladies so they can watch. On the right are the judges of France. The great political bodies are given much more prominence under Charles X of France than they were recently under Charles III of the United Kingdom. The Chamber of Peers and the Chamber of Deputies were specifically given a good place at the cathedral so they would not complain. And Charles X does swear an oath to the constitutional charter which had been given to France by his brother Louis XVIII in 1814. That was the key moment for most French people, that the king had sworn to obey the constitution. And here is a great painting of the coronation, very rarely seen, unfortunately, because he was not a popular king. It's by Baron Gérard again, and he is giving the accolade to his son, the Dauphin, the last Dauphin, previously Louis Antoine, Duc d'Angoulême. They are being watched with a rather sideways look by their jealous cousin, the Duc d'Orléans. Here, later, Louis Philippe, King of the French. The Archbishop of Reims is calling on the people to cheer the king, which they did, and the figure in front of the Archbishop here is the Prince de Talleyrand, Grand Chamberlain of Charles X, as he had been Grand Chamberlain of Napoleon I. The only figure who is in both David's picture of Napoleon's coronation and Gérard's picture of Charles X's coronation. The brilliant courtier and manipulator who knew how to adapt himself to every regime. And this picture was rather a success when it was exhibited in the Louvre. And Charles X is in fact crowned with the crown of Napoleon. There's a mixture of innovation and tradition. Here is the coronation banquet, like the coronation banquet you've seen before of Louis XV, his grandfather. After communion, before the coronation banquet, Charles X exchanged the crown of Charlemagne for his own six-arched crown of diamonds and sapphires made by Frédéric Baptiste. The French crown jewelers are back in force and would be throughout the 19th century, always adding to the value of the crown jewels. And this new crown was said to be worth 15 million francs. Le plus excellent morceau qu'ait produit l'art de mettre en œuvre la plus précieuse des substances. The most excellent example that art has produced to put to work the most precious of substances. And the crown had to be reduced to fit the head of Charles X because he had a smaller head than Louis XVIII. And there was also created a superb set. There he is giving the accolade to all the knights of the Holy Spirit after his coronation. This picture, rather amazingly, has recently been sold for as little as 6,000 euros in France. He kisses all the knights of the Holy Spirit, who included non-nobles, they included Napoleonic marshals, and they included Chateaubriand, who the king didn't really like, but he smiled, and as he held his hands in his, he said, "Chat ganté ne prend pas de souris." A cat with gloves on takes no mice. He'd wanted him to accept the government of Villers, but he wouldn't. And on the right here is Talleyrand as Grand Chamberlain of France. And this is the set of altar gilt, silver gilt, given by Charles X to the Church of Reims. A jug, incense burners, a chalice, a plate, and crosses. Doves were released after the coronation of Charles X, and they burnt themselves on the chandeliers. But what most impressed all witnesses of the coronation was the dignified and gracious bearing of the king himself, who seemed to be half his age. He was 70, but behaved as if he was 35. And it was said that no king of France had been crowned with such grace as Charles X. There he is, painted by Gérard. You can see copies of this picture in England, given to his friend, the Duke of Wellington, in Apsley House, and another friend, Lady Salisbury, now at Hatfield House. And here he is painted by Ingres, wearing the crown made for Napoleon, again with the hand of justice and the scepter. And he does look quite young. And his return from Reims, already the crowds are silent, they're rather hostile, because the government is bringing in right-wing measures to defend the church and to make it possible to leave all your property to your eldest son, rather than equal division as imposed by the Code Napoleon. But he does have a very magnificent coronation procession. As you can see, this is the prefect of Paris offering the keys of the city of Paris to the king, leaning out of his coronation coach. And here is the coach, probably the finest coach ever made in France, and it is in the Musée des Carrosses in the stables of Versailles. And if you have sharp eyes, you will see that there's the letter N on top of the coach, because it was reused in the way of changing French monarchies. It was reused by the Second Empire for the baptism of the Prince Imperial, son of Napoleon III. I'm sure it was more comfortable. I hope it was more comfortable than the coronation coach of England. Certainly more modern. And the king, he had his good sides. He was a patron of the arts. He had his liberal moments. He didn't like censorship of the press, but he was determined in the end to try and make a bid for absolutism. Here he is saluting the crowds in the garden of the Palais Royal at a ball on the 29th of May 1830, given in honor of the visit of the King of the Two Sicilies. It's the last great ball of the Restoration. He's being watched by his cousin and later usurper Louis-Philippe, Duc d'Orléans. And it was said at this ball, it is a thoroughly Neapolitan fete. We are dancing on a volcano. And 2 months later, the volcano exploded. The king issued ordonnance restricting the right to vote. It was already extremely restricted, restricting the freedom of the press, imposing royal authority. Paris exploded, and within 3 days, 26th to 29th of July, the monarchy was overthrown. The king retreated from Saint-Cloud to Rambouillet and then to England. He shows that he's given up, because from Rambouillet he sends back all the crown jewels which a loyal official had brought to him. He sends them back to Paris. And his cousin, Louis-Philippe Duc d'Orléans, shown here, leaving the Palais Royal in the middle of the revolution, the 30th of July, 1830. He leaves the Palais Royal with great courage. He goes through the streets, the rubble, the barricades, the revolutionary crowds of Paris to the Hôtel de Ville, and there he accepts to be Lieutenant General of the kingdom. And in effect, it's not the triumph of the revolution, but it's the triumph of the Duc d'Orléans. He takes control of the revolution with great courage and cleverness. He manipulates it and soothes it. He revives the constitutional charter. And here in 9th of August, 1830, in the Chamber of Deputies, he is installed as King of the French. It's the end of the traditional French royal court. There are no more coronations thereafter. He swears an oath, and that's it. And later, the crown jewels are exhibited in a museum. 1848, he himself is overthrown in yet another revolution. There is the interlude of the Second Empire, 1852 to 1870, when Napoleon III reigns with considerable splendor, but he has no coronation because his uncle Napoleon I had been crowned by the Pope. He could not be crowned by anybody less, and the Pope refused to come to Paris. Pius IX, who didn't like many aspects of the Second Empire, although it did defend papal power in Rome. 1870, the Second Empire in its turn is overthrown by a Parisian revolution, and the emperor and the empress also, like all previous monarchs, ends up in England. The Third Republic is proclaimed. There is a moment when it seems as if the Bourbon claimant, the Comte de Chambord, will become king as Henri V, but he scuppers his own chances by refusing to accept the tricolour. The Orléans claimant, the Comte de Paris, is briefly quite popular, but is expelled in 1886. And thereafter, as a sign of triumph, the Third Republic sells all the crown jewels it can, despite considerable public disapproval. It's consciously dismantling the monarchy. But old traditions die hard, as I said. The Fifth Republic is, in some ways, a republican monarchy or a monarchical republic, as is frequently stated by French writers. And gradually, the French government has been buying back the crown jewels. So if you want to evoke the splendor of the French monarchy, French coronations, and the French crown jewels, the best place to go is the Louvre, where you can see a version of David's coronation of Napoleon, and many of the crown jewels I've shown you tonight are on display in the Galerie d'Apollon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mansell. That was absolutely fantastic and thrilling, and how apt we are to have a discussion about coronations so soon after the recent one here. Would people like to ask questions? If so, there is a raise hand button on Microsoft Teams. Any questions? Well, while you're thinking about asking a question, because I can't see any hands yet, I'll ask my own. I was going to ask about obviously I'm aware Napoleon III didn't have a coronation, but as I understand it, he did have a crown made for at least for Eugenie, and it became the crown that was used for heraldic purposes as well, which is actually very different to his uncle's crown. I wondered if you could enlighten us a bit more about that.
Yes, you're completely right, Edward. That crown was made, and it is in the official state portraits of Eugenie. And I think, I must confess my ignorance, I think it was broken up after 1870, but I'm not certain. Maybe someone in the audience can enlighten me. She did, of course, take many of her jewels with her into exile, which helped finance the exiled Bonapartes. As Marie Antoinette had sent ahead many of her jewels out of France in 1791, they went to her sister, then to her nephew, who then gave them back to her daughter, the Duchesse d'Angoulême, in 1799. They helped keep the Bourbons going in exile, and some of them were sold only last autumn in Geneva by the descendants of Louis XV, the Bourbon Palmers, I think.
Ah, right. I believe Eugenie's crown is in the Louvre now.
In the Louvre, okay.
I think it was bought by someone and donated, having been sold by the Republic.
Yep.
Any other questions? Malcolm, yeah.
I was under the impression that the Pope didn't crown Napoleon, he crowned himself, and that his mother was painted in the picture by David. She refused to attend.
Yes, you're completely right. You're completely right. He didn't crown Napoleon. He came for the purpose of crowning Napoleon, but he was just a figure at the ceremony. You're completely right. And the mother was painted in, and other figures were painted in. She had quarreled with her son at that moment. And it's really the coronation of Josephine, and it's Josephine's grandson who will be Napoleon III later.
Thank you.
Any follow-up questions? I can see somebody's putting their hand up and then putting it back down. Edward, is that you, Edward Herbert? Nope. Can't see anything. Well, I'll be cheeky and ask another question, David, if I may. Philip, if I may. I was just wondering what were your impressions from the coronation the other week, and how does that compare to the sort of the lesser dressed down coronations of perhaps well, actually not if you include King Charles X, but how does it compare to the sort of the history of coronations in France?
Well, I thought it was very splendid. I enjoyed the music and the uniforms in particular, and the diversity of people attending and officiating. But I was very shocked, as you said, that Parliament was not more prominent, which is a key aspect of English royal tradition and had become a key aspect of French royal tradition in the 19th century. But I like the fact that he wore the golden tunic made specially for George IV. I hope he is as great a patron of the arts as George IV was. And I like the coronation coaches and, of course, the robes. But it's not quite the glamour of the young Elizabeth II.
No, and no fancy home inventions like the television to accompany it either. Well, if there are no further questions, it just remains for me to thank you again, Dr. Philip Mansell, for your kind presentation and thoroughly interesting talk on coronations. I will waive. I've got a signed copy. I will waive the most recent book, King of the World: The Life of Louis XIV, which is an absolutely brilliant read, especially if you are new to certain parts of French history, and I believe you touch on the coronation in there as well. And do look out for it at all good. Where can they buy this, Philip?
Well, it's now in paperback, and they can find it at all good bookshops like Waterstones and John Sandow in Chelsea, and of course in French in Paris.
Ah, yes. Well, paperback for the undergrads and French for the real diehard alumni. Yes.